prohibits the use of a religious test for higher office. It's actually forbidden in the United States to use a religious test for elective office. Despite that, you still have statements by presidential candidates and others who claim that they would not want a, for example, Muslim running or as part of the cabinet for the White House, the administration, and so on and so forth. So I would simply remind all of those candidates and everybody else the words of our third president of the United States, one of the most important thinkers of our country, Thomas Jefferson, who said, "The most sacred duties of government is to do equal justice, is to do equal and impartial justice to all its citizens." And I would hope that most of American society can continue to believe and follow those ideals and make it a reality here in the United States. Thank you very much.
If you're interested or have friends that are watching online, it's being webcast live on urdutimesglobal.com. So in case you wanted to share on that, thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'd like to echo Azam's sentiments. Thank you so much to Elmhurst College and to Dr. Huck for having me here and to give me the opportunity to not only address you, but to be in the august company of friends like Azam and Ahmed and now Meher. Okay. I'd also like to thank Uber for getting me here from the airport in exact time. So I'm just going to go ahead and get this out of the way and ask the question, how many of you watched the drubbing last night? Okay, now how many of you watched the debate? Because I was talking about the Falcons and the Saints. Okay. Well, it's interesting that as we are here in an election year, and the fact that it seems as though America wakes up every 4 years to become politically savvy, the truth of the matter is that the political cycle, and something that's been affirmed by the media, never seems to end. It just begins the day after Election Day, and then the cycle resumes. And it's interesting to then locate this entire edifice that we would call anti-Muslim rhetoric or anti-Muslim sentiment or Islamophobia, if you will, within this context. There's something about Washington and there's something about the presidential election that seems to then suck the proverbial oxygen out of the rest of the political and legislative process in this country. People seem to then ignore the down ballot, for example. And it's fascinating to see how much synergy has been underway at this level.
In sight, except unfortunately many people don't even bother flipping the ballot over when they go into the polling booth. Now, looking at Islamophobia, many of you, of course, are within your own minds and your consciousness have 9/11 as this line of demarcation. And it would seem as though at the point of 9/11 in the year 2001, that would have been the apogee of anti-Muslim sentiment. That would be where the proverbial iron was the hottest. But counterintuitively, there has been, in fact, an intensification of Islamophobia since that point. And in fact, Muslims have now surpassed atheists as the most reviled group in America. Being from Detroit, I remember that I was quite conflicted when the Lions were 0-15. Do we go for the record and be winless in the year, or do we ruin it with a victory at the end? And thankfully, Detroit is all about breaking records, and so we went 0-16 that year. But this is a rather terrible stigma to have, with no great offense to the atheists, because somebody has to be at the bottom, but why is it us? The notion of why there was this decline cannot just simply be explained through events that are happening elsewhere in the world or certain issues that were happening here, whether it was an extremist act or the like. It's important to recognize within the broader context what is happening in America. And my hypothesis about this was that America is in a state of moral panic. And this is going to, and I know this is going to sound somewhat pessimistic, it's going to be around for longer than the 2016 election, and irrespective of who will win. If one candidate wins, then the darkness is going to feel emboldened and empowered, and if the other side wins, then that side of darkness is going to feel even more disenfranchised and more angered about it. This country is going through a major demographic shift, sometimes reflected in what you would call, and we would call, the culture wars. But within a generation, the United States, for the first time in its history, will become a majority-minority country. And the countdown has already begun. Case in point, the 2010 census, which stated that for the first time in American history, the number of non-Hispanic white births has been eclipsed by the number of non-white births. Fast forward to the year 2013, and the Pew Center for the Study of Religious Life had a survey of religion in America, and for the first time in the country's history, it is no longer a majority Protestant nation. Catholics and the nuns, not Catholic nuns, but N-O-N-E-S, are now the two largest religious constituencies. So if there was to be, in the perception of not just a few people in this country, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant essentialization, then these statistics demonstrate with clear and convincing evidence that it's becoming less white and more brown, less Anglo-Saxon and more Latin American, less Protestant and more Catholic. For those who etch their identity in the permanence, in the eternality of this identity construction, it is a frightening prospect of the unknown, what is going to happen when America takes that turn. And it's not going to be, as Dylan Thomas said, something that people will go quietly into that gentle night. In fact, they will go thrashing, and we're seeing some of that blowback as we speak. Some of you remember in the August 2010 Time magazine cover story, "Is America Islamophobic?" And that was an article that was penned by Bobby Ghosh, who at the time was the editor of Time International, and now he's at the Hindustan Times by way of Quartz.com. And this is the first time that a major American media outlet had even used the term Islamophobia. So it's quite poignant. But in the sense, when we take a look at this issue, we need to frame it within this broader moral panic as to what is driving it. Well, why Muslims? Well, Muslims have essentially become the droids of America. No one is upset at offending them, and in fact, it can be very politically and economically lucrative to do so. Muslims are not Wookiees, for you Star Wars fans. We don't rip people's arms out of their sockets as droids. Wookiees have been known to do that. For those of you who remember Star Wars first one of the best ones. The other problem is that with our attention always trained on Washington, well, we know that over the last several years, not much is coming out of Washington that is productive or constructive with all of that gridlock, which makes the Kennedy Expressway certainly look as a fast lane on the Autobahn. What we need to recognize is that at the state level, there is not only activity that is targeting Muslims, but targeting several other demographic groups. And in that, it helps to then answer once and for all this question: is Islamophobia a disease, or is it symptomatic of a broader malaise? And I would contend to you that it is in fact the latter. And so I embarked on a study, which can be seen on ISPU's website. The report is called Manufacturing Bigotry, where I took a look at a 50-state analysis, looking at all the state legislation over the last 3 years in 6 areas, because these were the 6 areas that had the most public discourse around them. I wanted to take a look at voter ID laws, which have been enacted to restrict people's access to the polling booths, which disproportionately affects people of color. I wanted to take a look at immigration laws, which of course disproportionately affect people of color and certain ethnicity and ethnic background. I wanted to take a look at laws which restrict reproductive health access, again, something that affects women. LGBTQ laws, which affect people based on sexual orientation. Right-to-work laws, or anti-union laws, which particularly for us here in the Midwest and states like Wisconsin, Illinois, and Michigan is a particularly poignant one. And then finally, looking at the anti-Sharia and anti-mosque legislation, which affects Muslims. And what I found was simply, and this is an academic's greatest dream, an affirmation and a confirmation of the hypothesis. Yes, this was integrated. Yes, this was coordinated. What we found was that 12.5% of all state legislators nationwide and they came from one political party. Okay, I'll let you guess the color. Okay, it's the same one that upsets bulls in a bull ring. Okay, that they were behind all of this legislation. So if you look at the glass half full, you can say, wow, there's really not that many of them. 12.5% is basically 1 out of 8. The bad news is that, boy, they sure do wield an awful lot of power to be able to do this. And we find that some of the sponsors and the co-sponsors of anti-Muslim legislation were also responsible for sponsoring or co-sponsoring legislation that affected one of those other 5 areas. And we provided a legislative map, also available on ispu.org to see this, and it's quite interactive. It's actually kind of fun. I'll give you one illustration. Again, academics always look for that one shining example, the smoking gun, if you will, and that was presented to me by the state of North Carolina. In 2013, North Carolina seated for the first time since Reconstruction a Republican state legislature, as well as holding the governor's mansion with Pat McCrory. And they wasted no time in their efforts to try to pass as much legislation which affected these various demographic groups. In the summer of 2013, there was the dreaded SB 695, which was branded as an anti-Sharia bill. But before it went to the floor for a vote, someone tacked on at the last minute a rider which restricted severely women's access to reproductive health care. So essentially what this showed was not only that these were coordinated pieces of legislation, but that perhaps the real target was the anti-abortion legislation. They knew that had they led with that, it would create then a lot more hue and cry. If you lead with the anti-Sharia bill, you're not really going to get too much protestation. There's either not enough Muslims in North Carolina or the feeling that they lack the social and political capital to then hurt people at the polling booth. So we find 695 going in, and although some of the constitutionality of it has been fortunately challenged and has been repealed, we see this as being a plan and a strategy. Fast forward to this past spring, and we have SB 2, the transgender bathroom bill. So again, another one of these suspect groups coming out of the very same legislature that had passed SB 695. Now what's interesting about this bill was not just the targeting of the transgender community. Other aspects of this bill went even deeper in the encroachment of state legislature. In fact, they also banned the local governments from passing anti-discrimination ordinances. So this idea then of going for disenfranchisement through legislation has been now turned into a meme and has become a mantra and a methodology for so many across the country. Well, what to take of this and why is this important? As I mentioned to you before, the U.S. Census of 2010 stated that the demographics are changing. Well, the census, or the next census, is going to be up in 2020. But the census is not only used to map the demographics of this country, it is used by state legislators to go ahead and draw the congressional districts within each state. So it becomes critical then to see who's going to control the state houses in order to see how they may, as they have in Michigan, severely gerrymander districts in order to disenfranchise large swaths of the population based solely upon their demographic identity. So the notion then, in going into the polling booth in 2016 November, in order to cast a ballot for who is at the top of the ticket, or if in your state somebody is running for the Senate, of course the entire House comes up for re-election every 2 years. But what is happening at the state legislation? So manufacturing bigotry showed not only the importance of a more nuanced, refined, and deeper dive into the legislative, civic, and political process, but also the importance of coalition building. There is no single demographic group that is being targeted. Yes, maybe Muslim Americans seem to be catching the brunt of all of this effort, but I would submit to you that they perhaps are only then the canaries in the coal mine. legislators are able to then conduct this legislation with impunity because there is no fear of a blowback. But at the same time, it's a much more nefarious project and process going on where other groups are being affected. And as I look around at this audience, I have to think that every single demographic group that has been targeted is one that is represented here. And of course, we wear multiple identities, so there may be multiple areas of legislation that are affecting you without you perhaps even knowing it. And as we move forward to a country that is going to change with the advent of a majority-minority population within 30 years, as most demographers cite, it is critical then for Americans to come together as Americans in light of all of these efforts to divide and conquer. Thank you.